What if I told you that Max Verstappen could leave Red Bull Racing not because of the car, but because of a single person, and that person already has one foot outside the team? Because what just happened with Gianpiero Lambiase is not a simple internal change. It is a bomb that can completely break the most dominant era of Formula One. And the worst thing is that Verstappen himself already warned what he was going to do when this happened. Stay until the end, because what is happening inside Red Bull is much more serious than it seems. The relationship between Max Verstappen and Gianpiero Lambiase is not something common within Formula One. We are not talking about a driver and his engineer like any other duo on the grid. We are talking about a connection that was built since 2016 and that ended up becoming the absolute core of Red Bull Racing's success. A relationship where trust was non-negotiable and where every decision on the track went through a mutual understanding that went far beyond data or strategy. It was practically an extension of Verstappen's own thinking in race. Something that no other team has managed to replicate with that level of precision and stability. For years, this duo was the basis of everything, not only in moments of dominance but especially in critical situations where championships are defined, where pressure breaks most drivers. That was where Lambiase made the difference, not only because of his technical ability, but because of how he handled Verstappen, how he spoke to him, how he calmed him down, or even how he confronted him when necessary, becoming a key figure that kept the Dutchman in that perfect balance between aggressiveness and control, something that was decisive to build the dominant era that we all know. But all this becomes even more important when we understand the current context of the team, because Red Bull is no longer that solid and impenetrable block of previous years. The structure has been dragging internal tensions, questionable decisions, and a performance that is beginning to generate doubts. And in the midst of this scenario, the departure of Lambiase is not simply another casualty. It is the loss of the pillar that supported the sporting stability of the team, the only fixed point, within an environment that increasingly seems more unstable. And this is where the story takes a completely critical turn, because this situation does not come unexpectedly. There were already signs, there were already warnings, and most importantly, there was already a clear position on Verstappen's part, a position that now becomes the center of this entire conflict. Because when a driver builds his success around a figure as specific as his engineer, removing that piece not only affects performance, it directly affects his confidence in the project, his motivation, and his future vision within the team. What we are seeing right now is the beginning of a fracture that can change everything, because Red Bull not only loses one of the most important engineers in modern Formula One, it loses the bond that kept its star driver aligned with the team, and when that bond is broken, what remains is uncertainty, tension, and a question that begins to gain more and more strength within the paddock. How much longer will Verstappen remain within Red Bull if he no longer has the only person he really trusted? And this is where everything really explodes, because what for years was a solid and unbreakable relationship between Max Verstappen and Gianpiero Lambiase now becomes Red Bull Racing's biggest internal problem. Since Lambiase's departure not only leaves a technical void that is impossible to fill in the short term, but directly activates the biggest threat that the team has tried to avoid for years, losing its star driver. Because Verstappen is not just any driver within the structure, he is the axis on which absolutely everything revolves, from the development of the car to the most important strategic decisions. And when a profile like this begins to doubt the project, the impact is not progressive. It is immediate, it is devastating, and it is exactly the scenario in which Red Bull finds itself right now. A team that was already affected by internal problems and that now sees how its greatest asset could begin to disconnect emotionally and competitively. The most delicate thing about all this is that we are not talking about a simple discomfort or an adaptation phase. We are talking about a red line that Verstappen himself had marked a long time ago, a clear warning that now makes absolute sense. Because when a driver reaches the point of saying that his continuity depends on a specific person, it is not an air phrase, it is a declaration of principles. And Red Bull has made a decision that directly collides with that reality. From here on, everything changes, because the loss of Lambiase not only affects what happens inside the car, it affects what happens outside of it, in meetings, in development, in internal confidence, and above all in Verstappen's perception of the team, because if he feels that Red Bull can no longer offer him the perfect environment to win, which was precisely what kept him there even in moments of tension, then competitive logic begins to prevail over any emotional or contractual link. And this is the point where the situation becomes truly dangerous, because the current context of Formula One offers real alternatives, teams that are growing, structures that can promise stability, and projects that could seduce a driver whose only objective is to win, which makes Verstappen the most coveted piece on the market at the exact moment in which his relationship with Red Bull begins to weaken. What previously seemed impossible is now beginning to take shape within the paddock. Conversations, rumors, doubts. Everything revolves around the same idea, and that is that Red Bull could be losing control of its own destiny, because when a team lets a key figure like Lambiase escape without guaranteeing the stability of its star driver, what it is actually doing is opening the door to a change of era that can be much faster and much more abrupt than anyone imagined. And so, what began as a simple market news becomes a real threat, an internal crisis that puts the entire project in check, and a question that can no longer be avoided. If Verstappen feels that this is no longer his team, how long until he decides to look for a new path away from Red Bull? And now we reach the most critical point in this entire story, the moment where everything that seemed like a threat begins to become an increasingly closer reality, because Max Verstappen's situation within Red Bull Racing no longer depends solely on performance on the track, it depends on something much deeper. Trust in the project, and that trust is beginning to break from within. The departure of Gianpiero Lambiase not only leaves a technical void, it leaves an emotional and strategic void that Red Bull cannot immediately fill, and that forces Verstappen to rethink his position within the team from a completely different perspective, no longer as the dominant driver who controls the situation, but as someone who is beginning to see clear signs of weakness in the structure that brought him to the top. Because when a team begins to lose key pieces, when internal decisions raise doubts, and when the environment is no longer stable, the driver at the top does not wait for everything to collapse. He acts before, and that is exactly what begins to take shape here, a scenario where Verstappen could anticipate the fall and make a decision that would completely change the balance of Formula One. The most worrying thing for Red Bull is that this is no longer just a distant possibility, it is a narrative that is beginning to gain strength within the paddock, fueled by everything that is happening around the team, from internal changes to the loss of key figures, creating a feeling that the project is no longer as solid as before, and that the future is no longer as clear as it seemed just a few months ago. And this is where everything fits, because Verstappen's bomb is not a one-time statement. It is a warning that now makes all the sense in the world, a warning that Red Bull decided to ignore, and that can now have irreversible consequences. Because if the Dutchman reaches the point of confirming that decision, we would not only be talking about an exit, we would be talking about the definitive end of an era, the collapse of a dominance that seemed impossible to break. The outcome of this story is not yet written, but the signs are clear. Red Bull is at its most delicate moment in recent years, and Verstappen is closer than ever to making a decision that could shake the entire Formula One. Because when the most important bond within a champion team is broken, what comes next is never stability. It is change, it is uncertainty, and many times, it is the beginning of the end. What we are witnessing with Max Verstappen and Red Bull Racing is not a simple internal crisis. It is the most delicate moment of an entire era that seemed impossible to break, because the departure of Gianpiero Lambiase has exposed a truth that for years was hidden behind the victories. The absolute dependence on a structure that is now beginning to crumble piece by piece. Red Bull built its dominance around a perfect combination of talent, stability, and confidence, but when one of those pillars disappears, the entire balance is broken, and that is exactly what is happening now. The team has lost much more than an engineer. It has lost the link that kept its star driver aligned with the project, the connection point that turned a fast car into an unstoppable machine. And in this scenario, Verstappen's figure becomes even more decisive, because it is no longer just about winning races or championships. It is about deciding where his future lies, evaluating whether Red Bull is still the ideal place to continue dominating, or if, on the contrary, the time has come to look for a new path before the decline is irreversible, a decision that could completely change the map of Formula One. The big bomb, therefore, is not only what has already happened, but what is to come, because if Verstappen decides to take that step, we would not only be talking about a historic exit, we would be talking about the definitive end of a golden era and the beginning of a new struggle for power within the category, where nothing would be the same again. So the question is no longer whether Red Bull can survive Lambiase's departure. The real question is whether it can survive what that departure can cause, because when you lose the person who held everything together from within, what comes next is not usually a rebuild. It is usually a fall. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.